One of the more interesting characters in the recent video game Assassin's Creed Mirage is the poet Arib, who shows up throughout the story and whose affiliations with the conspiratory forces are a bit unclear.
لقد قرأت أشعاري. ومن أنت يا ترى؟
Arib is indeed another one of those characters that are based on a real historical figure, and her life can tell us a lot about society, music, and art in the Abbasid Caliphate during the so-called Islamic Golden Age. Arib al-Ma'muniya was a famous singer and poet that grew up in the Abbasid heartland of Baghdad and was possibly of Persian origin, as some stories claim that she was the daughter of the famous Ja'far the Barmakid. She belonged to the class or group of women called the Qiyan, who were essentially slave girls that were professional musicians and singers. This was an important institution in Abbasid society, and these slave women played a major role, especially in the musical life of the Islamic world. This is also why some Muslim clerics were skeptical of music at the time. Music was almost exclusively associated with slave girls, alcohol, and erotic promiscuity. But regardless of all this, music and these singing girls, the Qiyan, played a major role across the Islamic world at this time, and especially in the Caliphal heartland of Baghdad. And among all these singing girls, Arib is perhaps the most famous. We get most of our information about her from what is probably the most important book on early Arabic/Islamicate music and music traditions, the Kitab al-Aghani, or Book of Songs by Abu al-Faraj al-Umawi al-Isfahani, which catalogs thousands of songs, poems, and tells stories about famous composers, musicians, and performers from pre-Islamic Arabia all the way up to the 10th century when Abu al-Faraj actually wrote. And in this work, we are told that Arib was a prominent concubine of several Abbasid caliphs, including Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun, the two sons of Harun al-Rashid that fought a bloody civil war for the throne.
سأكون بخير. نجوت من 6 خلفاء. سأنجو من
6 آخرين.
She was eventually set free by Al-Ma'mun's successor, Al-Mu'tasim, but continued her career as one of the most loved musicians and singers in Baghdad at the time, becoming quite wealthy and powerful while still serving as musical performer and possibly lover of future caliphs as well. In this society, musical gatherings were basically everywhere, in the caliphal courts, in taverns, in private house gatherings or majlis, and in the religious gatherings of the Sufis. And with the probable exception of the last category, women like Arib played an important role in these contexts. She would have performed at such gatherings, both private and public. She is said to have had a beautiful voice and to have mastered the instrument known as the oud, or lute, with which she would accompany her singing. Being a musician at this time, especially as prominent as her, required an immense amount of learning and knowledge. You would often be expected to know any possible song that a patron could spontaneously request, and to be able to improvise and adjust the performance according to the audience and context, which in itself required deep knowledge of music theory in terms of the different modes, patterns, and rhythms that made up the musical system at that time. For this reason, there existed prominent schools of music at this time. One in Baghdad, associated with people like Ibrahim and Ishaq al-Mawsili, and which Arib would have been a part of. There was also one school in Medina, which also had a vibrant music scene, and eventually one all the way over in Cordoba, established by the famous Ziryab. Music was also strongly and almost necessarily connected with poetry at this time. The line between poetic recitation and singing was obviously very blurry, and musical accompaniment often had the express purpose of enhancing vocal singing and recitation, or as instrumental preludes to a song. It isn't surprising, therefore, that Arib was also a prominent and celebrated poet, and would perform those poems in different gatherings. A truly remarkable woman in many ways, of whom one account says, quote, "I never saw a more beautiful or refined woman than Arib, nor one who sang, played music, wrote poetry, or played chess so well." Once a slave, Arib used her skills as a musician, performer, and poet to rise in rank at the Abbasid courts, eventually through these efforts being set free and establishing herself as one of the most famous, powerful, and wealthy women in 9th century Baghdad. After a long and prosperous life, she is reported to have died in her 90s around the year 891, having lived through some of the most tumultuous events in Middle Eastern history, seen the rise and fall of the Abbasid dynasty, and foundational developments in the Islamic religion. In this incredibly eventful time, it's quite remarkable that a slave woman and musician still managed to make such a mark that we still remember her over 1,000 years later. And the fact that Assassin's Creed Mirage includes her as a prominent character makes sure that that memory remains and is strengthened, giving us a fascinating glimpse into society, music, performance, and courtly life in the so-called Golden Age of Islam.